There was a clause in a settlement no one had thought it necessary to mention to her. There was a duke who might have asked for her hand in the ordinary way and had chosen, for reasons that make sense only at 3 in the morning, not to do so. And there was a young woman who, at that very hour of a wet March afternoon, was folding 3 of her mother's dinner gowns into a portmanteau with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had already, in her private accounts, closed the house. The apron she was wearing had been mended 3 times, once at the pocket, where a slipped needle years ago had left a small white scar in the linen, twice along the hem, where the housemaid had knelt and hemmed again until the stitches took on the look of a private handwriting. The apron was not, strictly speaking, hers. It belonged to the household in the way certain household things belong, to whoever, at any given moment, was doing the work no one else was there to do. On that Tuesday afternoon in March of 1813, the person doing that work, in the narrow house on Half Moon Street, was Miss Sybil Ashworth, aged 23, buttoned to the throat in a gown of pigeon grey, with the expression of one who had already counted the silver twice, and knew exactly what was missing. The rain fell on London in that thin, silvered fashion that is neither storm nor shower, only a low, continuous conversation between the sky and the slates. From the drawing-room window one could see the corner of Curzon Street go slick and dark. From the study window, only the back garden and the small brick wall which the neighbours climbing Rose had, over the last 5 summers, gently colonized. The Ashworths still kept the pretence of a butler. His name was Fenning, he was 71, and he had gone that morning, without being asked, to pawn the last of the plate. Sybil had watched him from the top of the servants' stair. She had not called him back. She had instead gone down to the kitchen and taken from its peg the apron with the 3 mendings, and tied it round her waist with the 2 competent bows she had learned as a girl of 9, when her mother, dying, had wished her to know how such things were fastened. 3 days ago the letter had come. Yesterday the caller, this afternoon the tea. She had answered the door herself because there was no one else to answer it. The gentleman on the step had given a name she had not attended to. She had been counting in the quiet back of her mind the number of lumps of sugar remaining in the china bowl on the sideboard. 12, she believed. Perhaps 13. He had removed his hat with the small, self-effacing motion of a man well accustomed to being announced, and only mildly discommoded at having to announce himself. She had placed him in her father's study. She had gone down for the tea things. She had poured, retreated, and returned only when the little brass bell rang against the mahogany. He had asked, mildly, for a second cup. Her father had asked, less mildly, for the ledger. Sybil had brought both. She had lingered in the doorway a moment longer than was strictly needful. A letter lay open on the desk. Her father's hand, the loose, unmoored copperplate of a man writing at 4 in the morning, when the coal has gone out and the creditor's man is expected at 9, dated the previous Tuesday, signed in the wide, drifting flourish of a signature that had been rehearsed for happier occasions. And beneath the signature, in a separate paragraph, a clause of the sort men write when they have run out of every other kind of paper. A clause that pledged the half-moon lease against a marriage settlement that Miss Sybil Ashworth had not been consulted upon. The gentleman drinking his tea on the other side of the desk was, she understood then, without any change of expression, the Duke of Marchcombe. She did not know his face. She had never before had reason to. She knew his name in the way one knew the names of certain rivers, as places one had heard mentioned in the papers and imagined without ever intending to visit. He was somewhere between 30 and 34, dark of hair and light of eye, with the still, listening posture of a man who had learned young that the room would come to him if he did not go to the room. He was drinking his tea without sugar. He had thanked her for it when she poured, in the ordinary voice of an ordinary caller, and it had not occurred to her to look at him then, because ordinary callers did not, as a rule, invite one to look. He did not rise. He did not, as men in novels are said to do, apologize with his eyes. He asked quite politely whether she took sugar. "I have taken the ledger," she said. "That will suffice." There was a small pause in the room. The rain did the pause's work, tapping without hurry on the study window. Her father, who was sitting with the poor, upright dignity of a man who had for 2 decades sat in that chair as if it were a throne, and only recently discovered it to be a stool, cleared his throat once and did not know what to say. The Duke of Marchcombe did not clear his throat. He did not look at her father. He looked briefly at the letter on the desk, with the expression of one who had already read it several times and was reading it now for a reason unconnected to information. And then he set his cup down upon its saucer with a small, precise motion, and he waited. Sybil left the room. She did not slam the door. She did not, in leaving, permit her shoulder blades to touch the wood of the door frame. She carried the ledger to the kitchen, sat upon the flour barrel, and opened it upon her knees. The kitchen was cold. Fenning had not laid a fire, having been elsewhere, and the great copper pans on the wall gave back a dulled, weather-fatigued reflection that was not quite a reflection at all. The ledger, when it opened, made the small, dry sound leather makes when it has been kept in the wrong kind of drawer. The figures were what she had known they would be. £147 and 11 shillings owing to the wine merchant in Jermyn Street, whose patience had, by mid-February, taken on the colour of a bruise. £63 and 4 shillings owing to the coal factor in Chandos Court, who had that morning sent a boy to say that the next quarter would be, he regretted, cash on delivery. £211 owed on the half-moon lease itself, together with a note in her father's hand that read, "C. Marchcombe." She looked at the note for a long moment. She turned the page. On the reverse, in the same hand, there was another note. It read simply, "Daughter." She closed the ledger. She sat for a while on the flour barrel and thought about how many years it had taken for a house to become a place in which one's own name could appear without warning on the wrong side of a column of sums. She was not weeping. She had not the sort of face that wept. Her mother, dying, had told her that. "You will not weep well, my Sybil. Do not force it. There will be other things you do well. Those things will have to do." She had been 9. She had believed her mother. She had, in the intervening 14 years, been correct. She untied the apron, she folded it, she hung it back upon its peg. She went upstairs. The portmanteau lived in the small dressing room at the end of the corridor, under the window that looked over the back garden and the neighbours' climbing rose. It was old. It had travelled with her mother from Warwickshire in the year 1792 and had not been used since. She took it down. She opened it. She began quite calmly and without any inward drama to fold 3 of her mother's dinner gowns into it. The pale slate silk with the piped hem, the dove-grey poplin she had not permitted herself to wear even at family suppers, and the third, a plain twill of no particular colour, which had been her mother's morning dress and which Sybil had kept for reasons that were not, and had never been, sartorial. Between the second gown and the third she stopped, sat upon the edge of the small, hard bed, and wrote 2 letters. The first, to her aunt at Bath, requested a bed for a fortnight and the loan of a respectable bonnet. It was a short letter. It contained the words, "My father is in some difficulty." It did not contain the words, "My father has sold me," because Sybil did not, on principle, write in the language of melodrama, and because this was the part she would only later, in the coach going west, come to see clearly. She did not yet believe that what had been done to her had, in any final sense, been done. A wager, she had thought, on the flour barrel. He has laid me down like a card on a table, and he has done so believing he owned the card. But the card, she thought, folding the twill dress into the portmanteau with the 2 small pats one gives to a piece of linen one does not intend to see for a long time. The card is not obliged to consider itself played. The second letter she wrote to the Duke. She used her father's paper. She took it from the study when she went down for the last of her books, moving past the study door without knocking, without meeting the Duke's eye, where he still sat in the armchair on the far side of the desk, still holding his cup, still with the same listening posture, still with the expression of one who had committed himself to a room and would not, until his errand was concluded, leave it. She took the paper. She took the pen. She went back up. The letter was very short. It said only this. It returned the clause. It contained, at the bottom in her own hand, a single line. A settlement made without the party is not a settlement. It is a wager. I decline to be the stake. She sealed it. She addressed it. She went down. She put on her cloak. She placed the letter on the salver in the hall, where a footman, had they still kept a footman, would have taken it up in the usual way. There being no footman, she carried it herself to the study door. She did not enter. She knocked once. She waited. When the door opened, it was the Duke of Marchcombe who opened it. Her father had, in the intervening quarter hour, gone somewhere else in the house, perhaps to the cellar, perhaps to the small parlour at the back, perhaps only into the corridor which was, in that narrow house, the closest thing a man could contrive to a private room, and she placed the letter in the Duke's hand without touching his glove. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy. She did not in that moment permit her face any expression that could later be catalogued. She turned. She went out. She took her portmanteau from the top of the servants' stair. She left the narrow house on Half Moon Street with the calm, unhurried step of a woman on an ordinary errand, and she did not, in the whole walk to the coaching inn in Piccadilly, permit herself to look back. Behind her in the study, the Duke of Marchcombe read the letter twice. He did not fold it. He put it with the same small, precise motion with which he had earlier set down his cup into the inner pocket of his coat. He rose. He crossed to the window. He stood for some time, watching the rain do its low, continuous work on the slates of Half Moon Street, with the expression of one who had come to a house on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, expecting to conclude an ordinary piece of business, and had discovered at the bottom of the second cup of tea that he was not the sort of man he had thought he was. He said nothing aloud. He was, as a rule, not a man who said things aloud when he could think them, and even his thinking at that hour was of the interior sort that leaves no observable trace. If Sybil Ashworth had been in the room, she would not have known, from any adjustment of the mouth or the eyes, that he had been struck. She had already learned in the quarter hour of pouring and returning that his face was the sort of face that did not tell one anything unless it decided to. And she had already decided in the folding of the twill dress that she was not in the business of waiting for faces to decide. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening to this story from. The city, the hour. I read every one. And if these stories of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe a little more slowly, leave your subscribe here. It is my quiet way of knowing that you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in the England of the Regency. Characters, names, and situations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is pure coincidence. She reached Bath on the Friday. The coach had been full and cold, and marked by that peculiar staleness which the interior of a public conveyance takes on after the second night. She had shared it with a clergyman going as far as Marlborough, a milliner returning from a buying trip, a widow with a small dog which she called by 3 different names in the course of the journey, and from Chippenham on, an elderly gentleman who slept with his hat over his face and woke only to inquire, twice, whether they had passed Melksham. Sybil had answered him each time politely. She had otherwise held her portmanteau on her lap, and had opened once the second volume of a novel she had brought from Half Moon Street, because it had been the last thing she had put into the bag, and she had not wished to unpack the bag on the coach. She had not read it. She had watched the country go by, the wet green fields flattening out into the wetter greener valley, the low stone walls, the sheep with the expression of one who had already, in some earlier lifetime, seen everything worth seeing and was not now impressed. And she had thought at intervals about the ledger. Her aunt was Miss Prudence Waverley, 61, unmarried, small, upright, and possessed of a small annuity and a large opinion. She lived in a narrow terrace house on Rivers Street, with a maid-of-all-work called Betsy, and a canary who had over the course of 5 years learned to make the sound of the front door bell so accurately that visitors were, on their arrival, invariably admitted by a bird. Sybil arrived on the doorstep in her second-best cloak, with the portmanteau at her feet and the borrowed bonnet not yet borrowed, and her aunt opened the door herself in an apron of navy sarcenet, and said without preamble, "You have come, then? Good. The tea is on. Betsy has made a seed cake, which is not, I regret, of her best. She has been distracted this week by a young man in the greengrocer's, whom she is not, on any account, to marry. Come in. Take off your bonnet. You are welcome for a fortnight or for 6 months, as you prefer. I have paid the coal for the winter. We shall not freeze. Now sit down and tell me, in whatever order you like, what your father has done." Sybil told her in order what her father had done. Miss Prudence Waverley listened, cut a slice of the seed cake, ate half of it, drank her tea, and said, "Well, that is bad, but it is not, I think, the worst kind of bad. The worst kind of bad is when a woman is left with debts and no wits. You have wits. We shall see what can be done about the debts. As for the Duke," she said the word without inflection, as if it were the name of a street in a town she had once visited on business. "As for the Duke, I have known his mother. She was, in her youth, a woman of unexpected patience. It is possible she has transmitted this." "I do not require his patience," Sybil said. "No, my dear, you do not. But he may yet require yours. Now finish your tea. There is a house at the end of Milsom Street that has been standing empty since Michaelmas. The landlord is a friend of mine, and I have been thinking in an interested way about a small circulating library. You are good with sums. I am good with strangers. Between us, we shall, I think, make an establishment." They made the establishment. It took them from March to September to make it. By September, the house at the end of Milsom Street had been swept, painted the colour of clotted cream, fitted with pine shelves along 3 walls, and stocked, at first slowly, and then not so slowly, with the novels and travel books and volumes of poetry and quarterly reviews which the ladies and gentlemen of Bath were prepared to read at a subscription of half a guinea for the season. Aunt Prudence had put in £50 and a great deal of what she called conversation, by which she meant the daily standing in the doorway with a face of such affable severity that it drew in, over the course of a summer, first the widows, and then the widows' daughters, and then the widows' daughters' governesses, and at last, one by one, the mothers of subalterns and the wives of clergymen, and the 2 or 3 retired admirals who lived on Great Pulteney Street, and who read, all of them, novels of the most alarmingly sentimental kind. Sybil had put in the ledger, and her own particular quiet, and, after the 2nd month, a small notice in the local paper offering, in a smaller room at the back of the library, a school of accounts for tradesmen's daughters. The school was her own idea. Aunt Prudence had raised, at the announcement of it, one wispy iron-grey eyebrow, had considered, had lowered it, and had said, "Yes, that will do. Girls should know what men know. There is not, in my experience, one man in 50 who is fit to be trusted with a ledger unwatched." Sybil taught the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4, in the small back room with the yellow-washed wall and the one high window that looked into the paved yard where the coalman's cart came on Wednesdays. She taught 7 girls the first term and 11 the second. She taught them first single-entry bookkeeping. She taught them second how to write a receipt in a hand a court would accept. She taught them third, this she taught last, because she believed it to be the part they would remember longest, the difference between a debt and a wager, and how to read a contract, and where in the text of a marriage settlement one should look for the clause that had been added in the small hours of the morning by a man who had run out of every other kind of paper. It was said in Bath by October that Miss Ashworth kept her books in the same hand her father had once used to ruin his own. She heard the phrase twice. She did not correct it. The first time, it was said by Mrs. Hallowees, the clergyman's wife, who had said it in the tone of one paying an unexpected compliment. The second, by Lady Serena Price, who had said it in the tone of one delivering an unimpeachable insult. Lady Serena Price was the second daughter of a viscount aged 22 in Bath for the season, with an aunt of her own, and possessed of that particular species of beauty which is at its most striking in doorways, at its most tolerable in profile, and at its least defensible in speech. She had come into the circulating library on a Wednesday morning in October in the wake of two of her acquaintances, had walked the length of the shelves without removing her gloves, had picked up a novel by a Mrs. Radcliffe, of which the library owned 4 copies, had turned it over in her hand as if inspecting it for lice, had set it down, and had said, to no one in particular, but to Sybil in particular, "She keeps her books, one hears, in the same hand her father used to ruin his own. That is a distinction, I suppose. Some families have coats of arms." Sybil, on the other side of the counter, was writing out a subscription card for a Miss Hallowees. She did not look up. She finished the card. She blotted it. She turned it round, with the pen still in her hand, and pushed it across the counter to Miss Hallowees, who took it with a small, mortified nod, and hurried out. Sybil laid down the pen. She looked then at Lady Serena Price, and she said, in the same voice with which she had, the previous Tuesday, told a girl of 13 how to enter a 2-shilling loan of India rubber in a petty cash column, "I am obliged to you, madam, for the observation. The subscription is half a guinea for the season, payable in advance. If you would care to leave your name, I shall have your first novel sent round." Lady Serena Price did not leave her name. She left instead in a small flourish of police and irritation, taking her 2 acquaintances with her, and by the following Sunday it was known in the drawing-rooms of the upper rooms that Miss Ashworth of Milsom Street had set down Lady Serena Price, and that Lady Serena Price had taken it very ill. There was something in the phrase "set down" which Sybil, when it was reported to her by Aunt Prudence over the mutton on Sunday, disliked. There was something in it, she thought, of pistols and hedges. She had not intended to set anyone down. She had intended only not to be set down herself. What did the city say? What did the drawing-rooms of the upper rooms susurrate? What did the raised eyebrows of the ladies on the other side of the tea-table intend? They said what drawing-rooms always say, which is that the story was more interesting than any of the persons in it. And they said it in the shape of a name that Sybil had not heard in 7 months, and had not, in that 7 months, permitted herself to write in the ledger. The name was Marchcombe. He had come to Bath. He had come, in fact, twice. The first time, in June, she had not seen him. He had, according to the town, taken lodgings for 3 days at the Christopher Inn in the High Street, transacted some business with a solicitor on Queen Square, ridden out once to a property in Somerset with the solicitor at his side, and returned to London on the Thursday coach without, as far as anyone had noticed, calling on any household with a marriageable daughter or an unmarried aunt. The second time, in August, she had almost seen him. He had come out of Mailer's library on Milsom Street just as she was crossing the road with a parcel of new books tied in twine, and she had, in the sudden compression of the moment, stepped back onto the pavement, into the shadow of the awning at the tobacconist's, and let him pass. He had not seen her. He had been reading as he walked the spine of a book he had just bought, on the other side of the street, in the summer light of 4:30 in the afternoon. He had been, she had understood in the half-second in which she had let him pass, an entirely ordinary man carrying an entirely ordinary book, And there was in this, she had thought later, a small, quiet violence for which she had not been prepared. It was easier, she had thought, in the coach going west in March, to be angry at a duke than at a man who read on the pavement. She had not written to him. He had, in 7 months, not written to her. There had been once, in June, a letter from her father, very short, in a small, crimped hand not quite his own, saying that he was in tolerable health, that the house on Half Moon Street had been given up, that he was now residing with a cousin in Islington, that he asked after her, that he hoped she was well, and that he was her affectionate father, Ch. Ashworth. She had read it twice. She had answered it in 3 sentences, wishing him well, informing him of her address, and enclosing a bank draft for £8, which was what she had felt she could spare that month. She had not enclosed the ledger. She did not, in the ledger she now kept for the circulating library on Milsom Street, write in her father's hand. She wrote in her own. It was, as it happened, the same hand, the same small, tidy, round upright, but she wrote it now with the pen held slightly straighter, and she made the 7s with a small crossbar, which was her own innovation, and the pound sign she made, not with the ornamental flourish her father had learned at his own father's desk, but with a plain, fine loop that would not, she thought, embarrass her in any court of law. On the 7th of November, at 3:10 in the afternoon, in the middle of a Thursday, the door of the circulating library opened, and the Duke of Marchcombe walked in. She was, at that moment, on the 3rd rung of the small wooden ladder at the far end of the room, setting a novel by Miss Edgeworth back onto its proper shelf. She heard the door. She heard, second, the small sound the door made when it closed. She heard, third, Aunt Prudence say, in a voice of the kind of even pleasantness which meant, in the private code of that particular voice, that the person entering was known and was, in some sense yet to be established, of concern. "Good afternoon, sir. Will you take a subscription, or are you looking for a particular volume?" There was a small pause. He said, "A novel, if you please." He said it in an ordinary voice. Sybil came down from the ladder. She did not hurry. She did not, as it were, delay. She came down as one comes down a ladder on an ordinary Thursday, with one hand upon the upright, one foot upon the next rung, the eye upon the floor. She reached the floor. She turned. She walked, quite steadily, along the length of the shop toward the counter. He was standing on the other side of the counter, with his hat in his hand. He looked at her. He did not, as men in novels are said to do, apologize with his eyes. He did not either smile. He looked, in fact, with the expression of one who had walked a distance in cold weather in order to arrive at a particular door, and having arrived, was permitting himself for a moment only the act of arriving. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "Your Grace, I have, I think, come for a novel." "Then you have come to the correct establishment," she said. "The subscription is half a guinea for the season, payable in advance. If you have no preference, I can recommend the Miss Edgeworth." "I have," he said, "no preference." "Then it shall be the Miss Edgeworth." She reached the book down again from the shelf where, 1 minute earlier, she had put it away. She set it on the counter. She turned to the ledger. She dipped the pen. She wrote, in her own hand, with her own straight upright, "Nov. 7. Marchcombe. Belinda. Volney I." She looked up. "The subscription," she said. He put a small heap of coins upon the counter. He did not, she noticed, hand her the money. He laid it down. It was the manner of a man who had understood, at some earlier hour, that the woman on the other side of the counter would prefer not to receive coins from his glove. There were in the heap a half-guinea, 2 shillings, and a 6pence, which was more than the subscription required. She did not mention this. She entered the payment. She placed the coins in the small brass tray beneath the counter. She turned the ledger round upon the mahogany and pushed it toward him. "If you would sign," she said. He signed. He wrote in a hand which was small and firm, and had in it none of the flourish she had expected. R. Marchcombe. He set down the pen. He did not at once take up the book. He said without preface, without apology, and this time, as she noticed with the sort of small, precise attention she noticed everything with, in that quarter of an hour, rising very slightly on the balls of his feet, as if to acknowledge without ceremony that the moment required some form of standing. Miss Ashworth, I have come to ask whether you would consent to be courted from the beginning in the ordinary way. There was a small silence. On the other side of the room, Aunt Prudence, who was writing out a subscription card, did not lift her head. The canary, at the front window in its brass cage, made the sound of the front doorbell. Sybil looked at him. She looked at him for what was, on the small counter clock, 7 seconds. And in those 7 seconds she thought a great many things which she did not say. She thought about the flour barrel. She thought about the twill dress. She thought about the letter she had written on her father's paper. She thought about the 7 months in which he had not written. She thought about the June visit to Bath, in which he had not called. She thought about the August afternoon on Milsom Street, in which she had, of her own choice, stepped into the shadow of the tobacconist's awning and let him pass. She thought, too, about the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4, and the 11 girls, and the notice in the paper and the pound sign with the plain fine loop. She thought about all of it in the way one thinks in 7 seconds, which is not in words but in the small internal weather that precedes words. She said, "You may call on Thursday?" She said it in the voice she used to enter subscriptions. "At 4. "At 4, he said, "and you will bring, if you please, the original of the clause." He was, for the first time in the 7 months, permitted an expression which was not the expression of one who had rehearsed it. It was very brief. It was not a smile. It was, if one had wished to name it, and Sybil, watching him from the other side of the counter with the pen still in her hand, did not wish to name it, the expression of one who has, in the middle of a longer sentence, been given permission to breathe. "Yes," he said, "I shall bring it. I mean to burn it in your presence." "Yes," he said, "I had supposed that you would." He took up the book. He took up his hat. He inclined his head not to her and not to the room, but to some third thing which existed in the space between them and which he did not name, and he went out. The door closed. The canary, in its brass cage at the front window, again made the sound of the front door bell. Aunt Prudence looked up from her subscription card, laid down her pen, and said, in the voice of a woman who had heard rather more than she had appeared to, "Well, Milsom Street has not, I think, had such a Thursday in some years. You will require, I imagine, a fire in the back parlour. I shall speak to Betsy about the coal." Sybil did not answer at once. She was standing behind the counter with her hand still upon the ledger, looking at the door through which he had gone. There was, in the ordinary daylight coming in at the shop window, a small dust in the air where he had stood, and the dust was, she saw, illuminated in the sideways way that certain dusts are at certain hours of certain November afternoons when the light comes in low from the west. She was thinking, with the small, clean surface of her mind that dealt with the shop, about the coal. She was thinking, with the smaller and less clean surface which dealt with everything else, about a Tuesday in March, and a clause that had not been shown to her, and the 7 months in which she had learned, without being taught, how much of herself she could put into a ledger and still remain, at the other end of it, herself. There was something in his face, she thought, that had not been there in March. There was something that was not, she said the word inwardly, with the small, stubborn honesty which was, of all her habits, the one Aunt Prudence approved of most, apology. Because a man who apologizes with his face has, she thought, arranged the face. There was something, rather, of the man who has spent 7 months learning what he did wrong in a quarter of an hour, and has come at last to the door not to explain what he learned, but to submit himself to the woman he learned it from. It was not enough, she thought. It was, however, the beginning of a thing that could, over time, be enough. She did not say any of this to Aunt Prudence. She said, "Yes, the back parlour. Betsy will need to sweep the grate. There is soot from last Tuesday, and we shall need—" She hesitated only for a second. "A small dish. Something we do not mind. He will bring paper. It will burn quickly. I do not wish to scorch the mantel." "You wish," said Aunt Prudence, taking up her pen again, "to burn a marriage settlement in the back parlour at 4 on Thursday. Very well, Betsy shall sweep the grate. I shall myself go out for the whole of the afternoon. There is a woman in Beaufort Square whom I have been meaning for some weeks to visit. I shall visit her. Extensively." "You need not." "I need to," said Aunt Prudence, and did not raise her eyes from the card. The intervening week did not, if the truth is to be told, pass slowly. Sybil kept the shop. She taught the school on the Tuesday. She entered, in the ledger, 4 new subscriptions and 1 returned volume of poetry which the Reverend Mr. Hallowes had, with regret, torn the flyleaf of, and for which he had insisted on paying the shilling. She wrote, in the evenings, letters to 2 suppliers in Bristol about a consignment of new octavos which had been promised for October and had not yet come. She slept for the most part well. She dreamed once of Half Moon Street. She was in the kitchen, on the flour barrel, but the ledger on her knees was blank, and she was, in the dream, both untroubled by this and vaguely relieved. She woke at 6:30 on the Wednesday morning, dressed, breakfasted, went down. On the Wednesday afternoon a note came from the Duke. It was brought by a boy in the livery of the Christopher Inn, where he had again taken lodgings. It was written in the same small, firm hand which had signed the ledger, and it said in 3 lines, "Madam, I write to confirm my call for tomorrow at 4, and to say that I bring, in addition to the clause, one other thing which I hope you will permit me to leave, without prejudice, upon your mantel. It is not, I assure you, an argument." She read it. She folded it. She put it into the small drawer at the back of the counter, in which she kept, as a rule, only the more temperate class of business correspondence. She did not answer it. She did, however, at some point in the course of the Wednesday evening, take it out and read it again, once, and she put it back, and she did not take it out a 3rd time. Aunt Prudence went out at 3:30 on the Thursday, wearing her second-best bonnet, and carrying under her arm a small paper bag of the seed cake which Betsy had, on this occasion, done rather well. At 10 minutes to 4, the shop was empty. At 3 minutes to 4, Betsy came in from the yard to say that the grate in the back parlour was swept, that the small dish, a chipped pewter thing which Aunt Prudence had years ago put aside for the beggars, was upon the hearth, that the fire was drawing, and that if Miss Sybil would be needing anything, Betsy would be, in the front kitchen on the far side of the closed door, and would not, on any account, listen. Sybil said, "Thank you, Betsy. I do not, in fact, mind if you listen." Betsy said, "No, miss, I know, miss, but I would rather not if it's all the same." She went out. At 4, precisely, the front door of the circulating library on Milsom Street opened, and the Duke of Marchcombe came in. He was without his hat. He had in one hand a small, flat parcel wrapped in oiled paper, in the other a slightly larger object wrapped in a soft green cloth. He was wearing a coat of the dark, plain sort a man wears when he does not wish, on that particular afternoon, to be observed by the town. He did not at once speak. He came to the counter. He set the parcel and the object upon it. He looked at her. "The back parlour," she said, "is through there." She lifted the flap of the counter. He came round. She led him through the door at the back of the shop, across the small paved passage, and into the parlour. The fire was drawing well. The dish sat upon the hearth. There were 2 chairs and a small round table between them, and upon the table there was, waiting, a folded square of unbleached linen, which was what Sybil had decided, at some point in the previous week, to put out for the purpose. She had not, herself, quite understood why she had put out a cloth. It seemed, on reflection, to be the sort of thing one put out. He set the flat parcel upon the table. He set the object in the green cloth upon the mantel, with, she noticed, the small, careful motion of one placing something that could be broken. He did not, in either case, take his coat off. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "before we proceed, may I say only one thing?" "Only one." "I have been," he said, "an ass." He said it in the tone in which he had, 7 months earlier, asked for a second cup of tea, and the tone did not, on this occasion, betray the man. But the man, on this occasion, did not intend it to. Sybil looked at him. "That," she said, "is what I supposed you had come to say. Please sit down." He sat down. She untied the string from the flat parcel. She unwrapped the oiled paper. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. It was the letter from her father, dated the previous, from her point of view. March, and bearing at its foot the paragraph in the clause of the sort men write at 4 in the morning. It was the original. She recognized her father's hand. She recognized the crease from the desk. She recognized at the top corner a small stain, which was, she thought, most likely tea. "You have kept it," she said. "I have kept it. It has been in the inner pocket of the coat I wore that afternoon. I have not," he hesitated for a fraction of a second, "worn the coat since." "Ah, I did not," he said, "know how to burn it without your permission. You could have burnt it in your own fireplace." "That is true. But I did not wish, in the burning of it, to make of it a private matter." "It was not a private matter." She looked at him. She stood up. She took the paper. She walked to the hearth. She knelt quite easily, in the way of a woman who had learned to kneel for the fire in a kitchen with no footman. She took the small pewter dish. She set the paper into it, and she took, from the mantel, the little brass box in which the parlour spills were kept. She struck a spill. She held it to the corner of the paper. The paper caught with a small, polite sigh. The clause turned brown at the edge, then black. The ink of the paragraph, being lamp black of a middling quality, remained legible for a further 2 seconds, and then broke into the small orange threads that any ink breaks into when it goes. The signature at the bottom, her father's wide, unmoored flourish, was the last thing to burn. It curled. It parted. It went. The whole took, in all, perhaps 8 seconds. The oiled paper of the wrapper she also put in. For good measure, it burned faster. It smelled a little of hair. The room, when it was over, smelled of paper, ash, and beeswax, and the residual smoke of the fire in the grate. The small pewter dish, set back upon the hearth, was warm and empty and slightly, on its inner surface, blackened. She stood up. She dusted once her palms against her skirt. She said, without turning round, "The other thing on the mantel." "Yes? Is that yours to leave or mine to accept?" There was, briefly, a silence. "That," he said, "is, if you will permit me, mine to leave and yours to consider. If you consider it and do not care for it, I shall take it away again on Sunday, and we shall not speak of it a second time." She turned. She looked at the mantel. The object in the green cloth sat where he had put it. It was rectangular and small, and had, she saw now, in the reduced light of the fire, the shape and general proportion of a book. "A book," she said. "A book. Of what kind?" "A ledger." She did not at that move for a moment. Then she went quite steadily to the mantel. She lifted the green cloth. Beneath it lay a plain brown octavo, of the sort that stationers in the city sold at 7 shillings apiece. It was bound in calf. It had upon the front no gilt lettering. And it was, she saw when she opened the cover, entirely blank. There was, however, upon the flyleaf a single line, in the same small firm hand which had signed the ledger of the circulating library the previous Thursday. The line read, "For the accounts of the mistress of any house in which I have the honour to be received, R.M." She looked at the line for what was, on the clock upon the mantel, 4 seconds. Then she closed the book. She put the green cloth back over it. She did not. This was the thing she noted in herself later, with the small, clean surface of her mind that dealt with the shop. She did not, in that 4 seconds, permit her face to arrange itself into anything he would afterwards be able to remember. "Your Grace," she said. "Yes. You will take tea?" "With pleasure." She went out to the kitchen. She said to Betsy, who was standing by the range with her hands folded and her ear noticeably not against the door, "The tea things, Betsy, in the parlour, 2 cups, no sugar in either." Betsy said, "No, miss." "And Betsy," Sybil hesitated, then went on, "there is a book on the mantel in the parlour. I shall take it after His Grace has gone up to my room. You may leave it where it is." Betsy said, "Yes, miss." She did not, in speaking, permit her face any expression which could later be catalogued. Sybil went back into the parlour. He rose when she came in. He had not in her absence moved the small pewter dish. He had not touched the mantel. He was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out into the small backyard where the Coleman's cart had, the previous Wednesday, left 2 black wheel marks on the paving stones. He turned when she came in. He did not smile. They sat. Betsy brought in the tea things. She set them down. She went out. Sybil poured. She handed him his cup. She took her own. She did not, on this occasion, retreat. There was between them, upon the small round table, the folded square of unbleached linen. On the hearth, the pewter dish with its ashes. On the mantel, the ledger under the green cloth. In the grate, the fire. In the air, the faint hair smell of the burnt-oiled paper. And behind all of it, running through the room like an undercurrent in a piece of quiet music, 7 months of a silence which had at last been given permission to end. He said, "May I speak plainly?" "You may." "I did not," he said, "understand in March that you had not been consulted. I understood in the general terms in which men of my sort understand these matters that arrangements had been made. I did not attend to what the arrangements were. I did not, when I came into the room, look with any care at the person you were. I heard you say, when you brought the ledger, that you had taken it. I did not, at that moment, hear what you were telling me. I have, since that afternoon, heard it. I have heard it at intervals every day. I have come here today not to ask you to forgive me for what I did not hear. I have come to ask you whether you will permit me, over some number of weeks that shall be entirely of your choosing, to try to be the sort of man who would on any similar occasion hear it in the room." She did not answer at once. She drank her tea. The clock on the mantel, a small mahogany bracket clock which Aunt Prudence had inherited from an unmarried great-uncle, clicked in the way that particular clock always clicked, twice between the ticks. She said at length, "That is a great deal to ask. I know. You are asking, in fact, several things. You are asking my permission. You are also asking my time. You are also asking me to become, in some measure, the instrument by which you make yourself into a different sort of man. That is more than a lady is ordinarily asked to consent to in a first afternoon." "Yes, I am inclined," she said, "not to consent to the third." "That is fair." "I am inclined," she said, "to consent to the first 2. He put down his cup. He did not, at that moment, say anything at all. He looked at her across the small round table with the expression of one who had, at 4 in the morning when the coal had gone out, been given something he had not thought he had leave to ask for. And Sybil, watching him with the small, clean surface of her mind and the smaller and less clean one both engaged at once, understood then, with a certainty which she had not, in the 7 months, permitted herself to entertain, that whatever came next between them, it would not be the sort of thing a solicitor could put into a clause. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You will come then on Thursdays." "On Thursdays." "At 4. At 4. You will bring each time a book." It need not be a novel. You will pay for the subscription in the ordinary way. Yes. You will not, she said, call on me at Rivers Street. My aunt has agreed, for reasons of her own, to make herself absent on Thursday afternoons. She has not agreed to be absent on other afternoons. You will not, therefore, apply for a general acquaintance until such time as I inform you that she has been consulted. No. You will not, she said, speak to me or to anyone else of the clause. It is burnt. It is not a subject. No. And you will not, she said, at any time in the next 6 months ask me to marry you. There was a small pause. May I know, he said, the reason for the 6 months? You may. It is the length of time in which I judged that I could, from a flour barrel in a cold kitchen, entirely rebuild my life. It seems to me an equitable interval in which to require you to entirely rebuild your understanding of what it is to ask for a woman's hand. That, he said, is fair. Yes, I accept. Good. She lifted the pot. She refilled his cup. She refilled her own. She did not, in refilling them, permit her hand to tremble. Her hand did not, in fact, wish to tremble. She had, upon this, she noted quietly to herself, become in the intervening 7 months a person whose hand did what she asked of it. They drank the second cup in near silence. He spoke once of a mare he had bought in June at Tattersall's that was proving to have a soft mouth and a great deal of opinion. She spoke once of a boy in the school of accounts who had grasped, in the middle of a lesson on receipts, the whole underlying idea of double-entry bookkeeping without her having said so, and had stood up at his desk and announced it to the room. She did not, in speaking of the boy, permit any inflection which could be mistaken for a display. But he heard her, on the other side of the small round table, with the expression of one who had, in 7 months of silence, learned to hear a good many things which he had not, before, thought needed to be listened for. He said only, when she was done, "That is a good boy." She said, "He will do." The clock struck the half-hour. He rose. He picked up his hat. He put it on. He inclined his head to her this time, and not to any third thing between them, and he went out. She did not go with him to the door. Betsy went. Betsy, in the kitchen, said afterward to Aunt Prudence, when Aunt Prudence came home at 6:30, he said, "Thank you at the door, ma'am. Just thank you. Nothing else. He was ever so polite. I do not think, ma'am, he is the ordinary kind." Aunt Prudence said, "No, Betsy, he is not the ordinary kind. Very few of them are, when you take the trouble to look at them. Sit down. There is seed cake left. Sybil will be in the parlour. Do not disturb her." Sybil was in the parlour. She was standing at the mantel. She had lifted the green cloth off the ledger. She was holding the ledger open at the flyleaf, and she was reading for the second time the single line written in the small, firm hand. "For the accounts of the mistress of any house in which I have the honour to be received." She closed it. She set it back upon the mantel. She left the green cloth off. Outside the parlour window, the November afternoon had turned toward the early dusk of a Bath winter. The light coming in through the small backyard was the low, silvered light in which certain days end. The fire in the grate had burnt down to a bed of red coals with, at their centre, one thin white line of the ash of the claws. She stood at the mantel for a while and looked into the fire with the expression of one who had been given permission, at last, to acknowledge that a thing which had been done to her had not, in the end, been the final thing done. Then she took up the poker quite steadily and stirred the coals until the white line was mixed into the red, and the fire, having taken it, gave off no smell of hair, and the room, having taken it, gave off no sound at all. She went out. She closed the door of the parlour behind her. Thursdays that winter were the shape by which the whole of the week arranged itself. He came on the 14th and on the 21st and on the 28th of November, on the 5th, the 12th and the 19th of December, when the town was full of holly and Betsy had put a wreath upon the shop door. And on Christmas Eve, which fell that year on a Thursday at 4, when the light in the back parlour came in low across the paving stones of the small yard, he came bringing a small book of Cowper's poems bound in dark green leather, and asking, in the same ordinary voice with which he asked everything of her, whether she would permit him, since it was Christmas Eve, to sit for the length of an hour without a subject. She said, "You may sit without a subject." They sat. He came in January and in February and in March, when it was almost precisely a year from the Tuesday afternoon on Half Moon Street. He came in April, when the rain in Bath grew warm, and in May, when he had, at the beginning of a Thursday, brought her a small posy of primroses, which he had, he said, picked himself from the hedge on the way in from the Christopher Inn, and had, over the course of the walk, become embarrassed by carrying, and had at last transferred to the outside of his hatband, and thus brought in. She kept the posy. She did not keep it in the parlour. She kept it pressed in the flyleaf of the ledger he had brought her in November, on the same page as the line in his small, firm hand. She did not tell him. He did not, in 6 months, ask her to marry him. He kept, in this as in the other conditions, precisely to what she had asked. He came on Thursdays. He brought a book each time. He paid the subscription in coin. He did not call at Rivers Street. He did not speak of the clause. He did not. This was the thing she noticed with the smaller and less clean surface of her mind, the one which noticed everything. He did not once, in 7 months of Thursdays, ask her for anything at all. He drank his tea. He spoke when spoken to, and did not fill the silences when she chose not to speak. He sat twice for the length of an hour without a subject. He laughed once, in April, when she had told him, over the tea, a small story of an argument she had had with the coalman about the price of nutty slack. And the laugh, when it came, was a low, surprised sound which had in it no rehearsal, and which he had not, she thought, expected of himself. He looked afterward faintly disconcerted, in the way of a man who has caught himself in front of a mirror, standing straighter than he had thought. She had begun, in that laugh, to like him. That was the word she used quietly, in the private ledger in the back of her own head. Like. It was not, she was aware, the word the novels used. The novels used other words. She did not read the novels. She had a shop full of them, and in the whole of that spring she had opened none of them for herself. She had opened at nights only the ledger in her own hand, and once, in April, the little book of Cowper's poems he had brought her on Christmas Eve. She had read the Cowper without any particular impression. She had liked in it one line about a hare and one about a garden. She had not been changed by it. She had said to herself, closing it, "He has good judgment in a book," and she had said it in the same tone in which she had said of the boy in the school of accounts, "He will do." What did the drawing-rooms of Bath susurrate? What did the ladies of the upper rooms suppose? What did the raised eyebrows over the tea say? They said what they had already been saying, only louder. They said that the Duke of Marchcombe was in Bath a great deal that spring, and that his solicitor had been seen at Rivers Street. They said that Miss Ashworth of the circulating library on Milsom Street was, though of course only a shopkeeper, from a family of some remembered gentility, and that her aunt, Miss Prudence Waverley, was a woman with whom Lady This and Lady That had long been on visiting terms. They said the Duke had once, 10 years earlier, been said to be on the point of an engagement with Lady Aurelia Vine, who had subsequently married a captain in the Navy and gone to Antigua, where, it was reported, she was very happy. They said that Lady Serena Price, since her set down in October, had been going about telling everyone who would listen that Miss Ashworth had set her cap at the Duke, and that the Duke, being susceptible to such things, had fallen in with the mercenary schemes of a woman not of his station. Lady Serena Price said this, with variations, at teas at the assembly rooms, and once, injudiciously, at a small musical evening in Great Pulteney Street, at which Aunt Prudence Waverley was in the room, and heard her. And Prudence Waverley did not on that occasion set her down. She had at 61 given up setting people down. She preferred, she said, to let them stand for themselves. And Lady Serena Price stood at the small musical evening entirely on her own, for a full 7 minutes, until the young lady at the pianoforte had finished her sonata. By the beginning of June, when the 6 months came round, Sybil was aware that the town had decided about her. She was aware further that the town had decided about him. She was aware, at a level she did not bring into words, but which she carried quite steadily through the ordinary hours of every day, that if the Duke of Marchcombe were on any Thursday to bring, in place of a book, a small, square, black box of the sort that men of his station were reputed to bring to such occasions, the entire town of Bath, from the sedan chairmen on Green Street to the ladies of the upper rooms, would within 24 hours have described in circumstantial detail a scene which had not at any time before that Thursday taken place. He did not bring a box. He brought, on the first Thursday in June, a book on the drainage of low-lying land in Somerset, which he opened on the counter and, before ordering the tea, explained to her, at some length, in the ordinary voice with which he explained everything, on the grounds that she had, 3 Thursdays earlier, asked him what he did on the days when he was not in Bath, and he had told her, and she had, at the telling, asked to know more. She had, at the telling of drainage, been more attentive than she was to Cowper. He noted this without comment. He came on the 2nd Thursday, and on the 3rd, and on the 4th. On the 4th Thursday, which fell on the 29th of June, the day before her 24th birthday, he brought no book at all. He came in at 4. He was wearing the plain dark coat. He took off his hat, and he set it down upon the counter, and he said, without preface, "Miss Ashworth, the 6 months have passed." She said, "They have. May I speak?" "You may." "I do not," he said, "come this afternoon to ask you to marry me. I come to ask you what I ought at the end of 6 months to ask." She did not at first answer. She set the pen down. She looked at him across the counter. She looked at him for what was, on the small counter clock, perhaps 5 seconds. Then she said quite quietly, "The back parlour. It is not fitting, this, in a shop." He came round, she went in front, she led him through. Aunt Prudence was again extensively out. Betsy was again in the kitchen, with her hands folded and her ear noticeably not against the door. They sat. Sybil did not, on this occasion, ring for the tea. "You ought," she said, "to ask me 2 things. You ought to ask me first whether I have, in the 6 months, learned to trust you, and you ought to ask me second whether I have, in the 6 months, learned to like you. If the answer to those 2 is yes, you may then ask the third, which is the one you originally wished to ask, and if the answer to the third is also yes, you may then ask me the fourth, which is when." He said, "Have you learned to trust me?" "I have." "Have you learned to like me?" "I have." He was, for a small moment, looking down at his own hands, which he had folded on the top of the small round table between them, and Sybil, from the other side of the table, saw the small, precise motion of him drawing breath, which was the first time in 10 months she had seen him do anything which betrayed the fact that a man does, in ordinary practice, draw breath in order to speak. He looked up. He said, "Miss Ashworth, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" She looked at him. She looked at him for what was, on the mahogany bracket clock, 7 seconds. She said, "Yes." There was, for the 3rd time in the parlour, a small silence. He did not, on the far side of the table, permit himself any large motion. He did not stand up. He did not, as men in novels are said to do, take her hand, or kiss it, or press it to his forehead, or any of the other bodily arrangements which the novels find necessary. He did, however, quite quietly, unbend the small tension he had been carrying for the whole of the 10 months in the place at the corner of his mouth, where a man carries the ordinary business of not showing his life. And Sybil, watching him across the table, saw the tension go, and she thought, with the smaller and less clean surface of her mind, "There, that is what he has been carrying." He said, "The fourth question." "Yes." "When?" "In the autumn," she said. "In October, if it can be so arranged. There is a school of accounts which will run through the end of September. I do not wish to interrupt the girls in the middle. And there is a subscription list which will close at Michaelmas. And there is my aunt, who will require some warning of any change in her domestic arrangements, and who is not, on principle, to be hurried." "October," he said. "Very well." "And," she said, "the wedding shall be small. There shall be no notice in the Bath papers. There shall be no wedding breakfast at the Christopher Inn. There shall be," she looked at him steadily, "there shall be my aunt and Betsy and the Reverend Mr. Hallowes, and whoever on your side must for reasons of family be present. We shall not exceed 12 people. I have, in the 10 months, come to prefer 12. "I have," he said, "in the 10 months also come to prefer 12. "Good." She rose. She went to the mantel. She lifted the green cloth off the ledger. The ledger had, for 7 months, sat upon the mantel with the green cloth beside it, but never quite over it, and she opened it. She dipped from the small inkwell upon the corner of the mantel the pen which she had that spring begun to keep in the parlour for the purpose of writing down whatever, on a Thursday, needed to be written down. And she wrote, in her own hand, with her own straight upright, on the first page of the ledger, beneath the line which he had in November written on the flyleaf, 29 June 1814, received. 1 proposal in the ordinary way. Given 1 consent without any clause whatever. Ashworth, S. She turned the ledger round. She pushed it across the mantel toward him. He rose. He came to the mantel. He read what she had written. He picked up the pen. He wrote beneath her line in his small, firm hand, "Received 1 consent, R. Marchcombe." He set down the pen. He did not, in setting it down, permit the small motion of his hand to touch hers upon the mantel, but the 2 hands were, for a small moment, on the same piece of wood, at the same time in the low silvered light coming in at the parlour window. And Sybil, standing on his left, understood then, in the way one understands the endings of certain very long sentences, that the whole quiet business of the 10 months had, in its entirety, come down to this: 2 names in 1 hand, in 1 ledger, on 1 mantel, in 1 house that was not either of theirs. It was enough. It was more than enough. The wedding, when it came, was on the 7th of October, at 11 in the morning, in the small chapel of ease on the Bath side of Bradford-on-Avon, which the Reverend Mr. Hallowes had recommended for its brevity of liturgy and its excellent acoustics. And there were, in the whole party, 11 persons, of whom 7 were on the bride's side and 4 on the groom's. Aunt Prudence Waverley wore her best silk. Betsy wore, for the first time in her adult life, a new bonnet, which had been given to her by Sybil, and which Betsy had, in the intervening week, taken out 3 times to look at, and, on each occasion, put away again, with the small, ferocious care of a woman who had not previously believed such things belonged to her. Fenning, the 71-year-old butler from Half Moon Street, retrieved by the Duke's own solicitor from a small cottage in Islington, where he had been living since the giving up of the house, on the £8 a month which Sybil had, without saying so to anyone, been sending him, sat in the 3rd pew from the front, in a coat which had been given to him by the Duke, and which fit him, with only minor adjustments, quite well. Charles Ashworth, aged 58, once the master of the narrow house on Half Moon Street, sat in the front pew on the bride's side. He had come up from Islington, unannounced, 3 days earlier. He had presented himself at the door of the shop on Milsom Street at 9:30 in the morning in his second-best coat, with the expression of one who did not know whether he would be received. Sybil had received him. She had taken him into the back parlour. She had, without any change of expression, poured him tea. She had listened to him say, in the small, crimped hand of his voice, the things he had spent the better part of a year finding the courage to say. She had listened to the whole of it without interruption. At the end of it she had said, in the voice with which she entered subscriptions, "You will come to the wedding. You will sit in the front pew. You will not, in your speech at the breakfast, refer to any settlement or to any clause or to any afternoon in March. You will speak of my mother. That will suffice." He had spoken of her mother. He had, in speaking of her, wept. Sybil had not wept. Her mother had 15 years earlier told her that she would not weep well. Her mother had been correct. The Duke of Marchcombe stood at the altar in a coat of the dark plain sort and did not smile. He looked at her as she came up the short aisle upon her aunt's arm, with the expression of one who had, in 10 months of Thursdays, learned to look at a woman not as one looks at a room one intends to enter, but as one looks at a room one has, with permission, been permitted to inhabit. And Sybil, coming up the aisle, saw the look, and she did not, in her own face, arrange any answer to it. She did not need to. He had, in the 10 months, learned to read her face without the answers. After the ceremony, there was a small breakfast at the Christopher Inn in a private parlour, at which 12 persons ate ham and eggs and drank 1 glass each of a very tolerable champagne. Aunt Prudence Waverley made a very short speech in which she said of her niece only that she had come to Bath in March 1813 with a portmanteau and a ledger, and was leaving Bath in October 1814 with a husband and a shop, and that as far as she, Prudence Waverley, was concerned, the shop was the more remarkable of the 2 accessions, though the husband was, she was prepared to allow, of the acceptable kind. There was a small ripple of laughter. The Duke of Marchcombe laughed with them. It was again a low, surprised sound. He looked again, faintly disconcerted. He had, over the course of 10 months of Thursdays, allowed himself the sound perhaps 6 times in all. And Sybil, on his left, understood, with the small, clean surface of her mind that noticed everything, that she was probably the only person in the room who could tell that he had done so. Charles Ashworth spoke in his turn of his wife, of Sybil's mother, who had died in 1799 of a fever which the doctors had at the time called putrid, and which Charles Ashworth had, in the 15 years since, called by no name at all. He spoke of her for exactly 3 minutes. He did not in the speaking refer to any settlement or to any clause or to any afternoon in March. He referred once to the way his wife had folded linen, and Sybil, sitting at the small round table with the Duke of Marchcombe on her right and Aunt Prudence Waverley on her left, thought about the flour barrel and the twill dress, and the 2 competent bows a girl of 9 learns to fasten when her mother is dying, and she did not, in the thinking, arrange her face into anything the room would remember. They left, at 3, in the carriage. The carriage went to Somerset, to a small property of the Duke's, which was not the seat, and which was not in fact entailed, and which he had, some time in the previous May, quietly put into her name as part of what he called, when he mentioned it to her at all, the ordinary provisions for a wife. The property had a house of 11 rooms and a walled garden and a library with 2 flights of forged iron stairs, and Sybil, in the afternoon of the 8th of October, went into the library and stood in the middle of it for some time without saying anything at all. The Duke came in behind her. He did not, at first, speak. She said without turning round, "The books." "Yes." "Who chose them?" "I did. Except for a shelf on the east wall, which was my mother's." "And the shelf on the west wall at the top?" "I have not," he said, "yet decided who ought to choose it. I had thought in April that perhaps I would leave it and see." She turned. She looked at him across the length of the room. On the other side of the small round reading table which stood at the center of the library, in the light coming in through the tall southern window, he looked for a moment exactly as he had looked in the parlor at Rivers Street on a Thursday in November, and exactly, too, as he had looked in the study on Half Moon Street on a wet March afternoon in 1813. And Sybil, on the other side of the table, understood, with a certainty of a kind she had not previously permitted herself, that these were the two men she had married. She had married the one in the parlor on purpose. She had married the other in the study by accident, and she would spend, she thought, the remainder of her life making of the accident and the purpose one man. "I shall choose the shelf on the west wall at the top," she said. "Good. I shall put upon it," she said, "the ledger you gave me in November of 1813, and the small book of Cowper you gave me on Christmas Eve, and the primrose which is pressed in the fly-leaf of the ledger, and which you gave me in May, and did not know that I had kept. And I shall put upon it at the end the ledger of the School of Accounts, which I have transferred for the coming term to a Miss Hallowes, and which I mean to keep looking at from time to time, so that I do not forget." He said, "What was it that you did not wish to forget?" She said, "That I taught 11 girls how to read a contract, and that I did it in a room with a yellow-washed wall and one high window that looked into a paved yard where the Coleman's cart came on Wednesdays, and that I did it in the same hand my father once used to ruin his own." He was, at that, quiet for a small moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is a good thing not to forget." She crossed the room. She stopped on the other side of the small, round reading table at the point at which any further step would have brought her within reach of him. And there, in the light coming in through the tall southern window, she said the last of the 4 things she had needed to say to him in 10 months. "Your Grace, the greenhouse," he said. "Yes? You have not yet shown it to me." "No." "Is it kept?" she said. "At 16 degrees?" There was, on the other side of the small round reading table, an expression on his face which he had not before, in all the 10 months, permitted himself. It was not the sound he had made at the story of the Coleman. It was not the small unbending at the corner of his mouth in the parlor at Rivers Street. It was the expression of a man who has been given, very late, and by the woman who had every reason not to give it, permission to be understood. "Yes," he said. "It is kept at 16 degrees since November of last year. I did not know that you knew." "I did not," she said, "know that I knew. I know now. I should like to see it in the morning." "You shall see it in the morning." "Good." She did not, at any point in that afternoon, put her hand into his. She did not need to. She did, however, when she went past him toward the door of the library, permit her arm in going past to touch the sleeve of his coat, and he, when she had gone past, permitted himself for the length of one breath to close his eyes, and neither of them, in the whole of that motion, said anything at all. Outside in the garden, the October rain had begun again. It came down onto the walled garden and onto the low glass roof of the greenhouse in the small, silvered, thin manner of a rain, which is neither storm nor shower, only a low, continuous conversation between the sky and the slates. It fell also on the eaves of the library, and it fell in Bath, on the roof of the narrow house on Rivers Street, where Aunt Prudence Waverley was, at that hour, sitting in the small parlour with Betsy, drinking tea. It fell on the shop on Milsom Street, where the new subscription card for Miss Hallowes lay upon the counter, waiting for the Michaelmas term. It fell on the small brick wall of the back garden of the narrow house on Half Moon Street, where a new family had, 3 months earlier, taken the lease, and where the neighbour's climbing rose was that autumn, doing rather well. She had gone back to the book. The rain had gone on, stories told with quiet love. A letter with no date arrived, bearing a weight the autumn had chosen to keep. A debt, a name that the city was pleased to fear, in the language nobody spoke. She folded her fear into linen and chose the road no one else would see. It was so, without promising any word, that two strangers found one another in cold. He was the man that London had judged unquiet in the ordinary evening dark. She was the woman who had learned on a flour barrel to trust her hand again. A letter with no date arrived, bearing a weight the autumn had chosen to keep. A debt, a name that the city was pleased to fear, in the language nobody spoke. She folded her fear into linen and chose the road no one else would see. It was so, without promising any word, that two strangers found one another in cold. He was the man that London had judged unquiet in the ordinary evening dark. She was the woman who had learned on a flour barrel to trust her hand again. If stories like this keep you company through the evening, leave a comment and a subscribe. It is what keeps them being told here. This is a work of fiction set in the English Regency. Any resemblance to real persons or events is pure coincidence.